In 1969, Don Fisher couldn't find a pair of Levi's in his size. So he opened a store in San Francisco that always had jeans in every size on every shelf. He called it the Gap. The name came from the generation gap, the cultural distance between baby boomers and their parents that defined the late 1960s. The store was built on a simple proposition. You could always find what you came for, in your size, at a fair price. No trend, no fashion statement, the foundation beneath fashion. Gap was classic American style, simple, functional, optimistic. Through the 1980s and 1990s, under CEO Mickey Drexler, that proposition became one of the most commercially powerful in American retail. The Individuals of Style campaign, running from 1988 through 1993, featured celebrities in Gap basics and produced average annual sales growth of 43%. The 1998 khaki swing television ad, dancers doing the Lindy Hop in Gap khakis to Louis Prima, became one of the most recognized retail campaigns of its era. At its peak under Drexler, Gap achieved its highest market capitalization at $43.4 billion in 2000. Then, in the same period, the late 1990s, something changed. Not in the market exactly. In the Gap itself, Gap's product switch was partly a result of a shift in the late 1990s in fashion trends, away from basic casual clothes to a flashier look favored by young women. Gap moved away from the look that made it famous and added trendy clothes like denim jackets with glitter and tight-fitting fashions to its product mix. Customers walking into their favorite Gap store in search of a pair of basic khakis found orange and turquoise cropped jeans embellished with silver studs. The brand that had been trusted to get basics right had stopped making the basics its customers had trusted it for. The people who had relied on Gap for the reliable thing started going elsewhere, and the customers Gap was now designing for, trend-oriented young women, had better options than the competitors who were arriving at exactly this moment. By the early 2000s, the market was flooded with competition at lower prices. Even its own Old Navy cannibalized Gap's business, as did foreign invaders the likes of H&M in 2000 and Uniqlo in 2005. This is the competitive context that makes the Gap's brand drift more consequential than it would otherwise have been. If the Gap had drifted into trend-chasing fashion in a period without serious competition, it might have recovered. Instead, it drifted at precisely the moment when a category of faster, cheaper, trend-focused competitors arrived. Competitors who did fashion at the lower price points with more variety and more frequency than the Gap's operating model could match. H&M and Zara were not competing on the Gap's original proposition. They were competing on the proposition the Gap had temporarily vacated its original position to enter. The Gap was now fighting a fashion battle on terrain it had spent 30 years not building capabilities for, against competitors who had been built for nothing else. Drexler was criticized for abandoning the basics and becoming too fashionable. The Gap Inc. experienced its largest sales decline in the company's history. Drexler was fired in 2002. The company then rotated through several CEOs: former Disney executive Paul Pressler, drugstore executive Glenn Murphy, and Gap veteran Art Pick. The Gap's failure is all about its lack of leadership, said Mark Cohen, the director of retail studies at Columbia University's business school. Have you ever watched a brand lose its specific competitive position, the precise thing it was trusted for, and discover that the position it had abandoned was considerably harder to reclaim than it was to leave? Leave a comment. By the early 2000s, Gap had overexpanded. There were too many stores in the same malls. The collections started to feel repetitive. The brand lost the ability to surprise people. Basics became boring and competitors started catching up. This is the third problem, distinct from the trend chasing and distinct from the competitive arrivals: overexpansion. Between May 2002 and January 2006, the number of Gap North America outlets fell from 1,599 to 1,335, a 15% decline. For the full year 2005, Gap North America's sales shrank from $5.7 billion to $5.4 billion. In fiscal 2000, the unit had accounted for $5.9 billion in sales. The stores that had been opened during the peak expansion period, in the late 1990s, when the brand's momentum made every new location feel viable, were now cannibalizing each other. 2 Gap stores in the same mall or 2 in the same downtown block do not serve double the customers. They divide the same customer base between them while carrying full operating costs. The overexpansion compounded the trend-chasing problem in a specific way. A brand that has moved away from its original proposition and is now operating at too many locations is a brand that cannot be easily repositioned. Repositioning requires a coherent new statement. Too many stores in too many contexts with too much existing merchandise and too many existing operational commitments makes that coherence structurally difficult to achieve. Gap's peak revenue of $7.3 billion 20 years ago has declined relentlessly. Gap at its peak was all about mundane product with brilliant marketing, noted Jeffrey Sword, founding partner at Merchandising Metrics. If the specific mechanism, how a brand that abandons its specific competitive position in the same period that directly competing alternatives arrive, finds itself without a defensible position in either direction, is the level of analysis you come here for. The like is the direct signal. The employees who worked at Gap locations during the store closure period, the associates who had built relationships with customers, the managers who had maintained the retail standards that defined the brand's experience, were not failing at their jobs. The stores were being closed not because of anything the people in them had done wrong, but because decisions made above them about product direction, about expansion pace, about which competitive battle to fight, had produced a brand that was by the mid-2000s between positions rather than occupying one. Old Navy, the Gap's budget sub-brand, had been created in 1994, specifically as the lower price point version of the Gap's original proposition. Good basics at the most accessible prices. Old Navy became the most commercially successful brand in Gap Inc.'s portfolio, not because it had done something more sophisticated than the Gap, but because it had continued doing the specific thing the Gap had started doing in 1969 and had moved away from in the late 1990s. The brand that stayed specific grew. The brand that tried to be broader lost the thing that made it specifically trustworthy. This is the uncomfortable structure of the Gap story. The most commercially successful expression of the Gap's original proposition was not the Gap. It was the budget brand created to be below the Gap. The Gap had departed its own position so completely that its own sub-brand had become the cleaner version of what the Gap had originally been. The Gap case teaches something specific about brand trust that the standard "they lost relevance" framing obscures. Brand trust is not a general quality. It is not people trust this brand. It is always trust for a specific thing. People trust this brand to deliver X reliably. When a brand is trusted, it is trusted for something in particular. The Gap was trusted for basics, reliable, well-made, accessible basics. That trust was the foundation of $43 billion in market capitalization. Gap's problems started when the company moved away from the look that made it famous. Not because fashion trends changed in a way that made basics less valuable. Basics have been commercially viable for every year since 1969. But because the brand that was trusted for basics stopped making the thing it was trusted for, and the trust, which was not for the brand in general but for the specific thing, had no object left to attach to, the practical thing. For any brand with a genuine point of trust, identify specifically what customers trust it for, not in general terms, but in product-specific terms. Then ask whether every current product decision either strengthens or at minimum maintains that specific trust. The moment product decisions start being made on the basis of adjacent commercial opportunity rather than on the basis of what maintains the specific trust, the trust begins to erode, quietly, gradually, and in ways that are visible to customers long before they're visible in quarterly revenue. Gap's biggest mistake wasn't falling behind on trends. It was forgetting why people cared in the first place. The next episode looks at the inverse of this problem. A company whose commitment to its specific proposition was so rigid that it prevented the adaptations the market was requiring, and where the unwillingness to move produced a different kind of irrelevance from the one the Gap experienced by moving too much. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.